Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to the Bretton Woods Committee's 2021 annual meeting. We are very fortunate today to be joined by the IMF Managing Director, Ms. Kristalina Georgieva. And Managing Director, we know what a busy week this is for you, so we very much appreciate you taking the time to be with the Bretton Woods Committee here today. Before I turn it over to you, just a couple of comments from me. All week at the Bretton Woods Committee annual meeting, we've been discussing how to secure a balanced and sustainable global recovery. We kicked off our annual meeting on Monday with a session on sovereign debt, where we launched a new initiative, a new working group on sovereign debt. And the working group released their introductory report titled Sovereign Debt, a Critical Challenge. So if you haven't read it, I encourage our audience to go to our website and download a copy of the report. And you can also watch a recording of that session, which featured our very own John Lipsky, who's also with us today. So today we will be hearing from the Managing Director, her perspective on the global economic outlook, how debt buildup could play a part in recovery prospects, and also how the IMF is seizing this new COVID-induced Bretton Woods moment to accelerate the transition to a green economy. We will reserve some time at the end for audience questions. So if you have a question, please submit it by typing it into the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar or by submitting it into the chat function. And finally, I want to thank our annual meeting sponsors, SICBA Holdings, Morgan Stanley, and Standard Chartered for their generous contribution to this year's event. And let me just quickly introduce our speakers before I turn it over. Our distinguished guest, who really needs no introduction, Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, is the Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund and has served in that capacity since October 2019. She is the first Managing Director from an emerging market and the second female to hold the position. She has had a distinguished career in public service, including a long tenure at the World Bank, where she most recently served as CEO and also a stint as interim president. She was previously instrumental in shaping the European Union agenda through senior positions at the European Commission. So once again, Managing Director, thank you so much for being here today. And our moderator today, Mr. John Lipsky, he is the Vice Chair of our Bretton Woods Committee Board of Directors, and he is also co-chairing the new initiative on sovereign debt. Previously, John served as the first Deputy Managing Director at the IMF. He also spent a lot of time in the private sector, notably at JP Morgan. He is currently at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So John, we can't thank you enough for your commitment to the Bretton Woods Committee and your leadership. And I will turn it over to you to kick off our discussion with the MD.
Great, thanks, Emily. And let me add my welcome and great thanks to the Managing Director for taking this time. And I expect everybody here in the audience understands this. For a Managing Director of the IMF, spring meetings and annual meetings are just a nonstop whirlwind, including such high importance meetings, the G7 finance ministers, the G20, the IMFC, the International Monetary and Financial Committees coming up, and a whole series of meetings everyone wants to hear from the Managing Director. She's shown more energy than I can imagine. I'm wrapped in my admiration for her abilities and her leadership. And thank you very much for taking the time. So without further ado, I think the audience wants to hear from you. The fund has just released its World Economic Outlook, and I think the press has noted, and I suspect this audience noted, that the forecast, the outlook for the advanced economies has been improved. But a theme that we heard from the World Economic Outlook is divergence. Managing Director, how serious is divergence, and what do you see as the implications for this outlook?
Thank you very much, John, and if I may, and many thanks to the audience. The Bretton Woods Committee, understandably, is very close to my heart. You support the institutions, and I have this unique privilege to have served in both of them. And it is a moment where bringing new energy into the work of the institutions is an imperative, because we are globally, as a world, we are at a turning point. Yes, we came up with a brighter picture for the world, But as I like to quote Tolstoy, he says, all the variety of life is made up of light and shadow. And you're rightly asking me not so much about the light, you're asking me about the shadow. Divergence is potentially a long shadow over the recovery and over the capacity of the world as a whole to take a turn on digital, on climate, on inequality. Where exactly we find ourselves? A small group of countries led by China from last year, US from this year, a couple of advanced economies and a couple of emerging market economies are going to see their fortunes likely return to the pre-pandemic trajectory by the end of 2021. Majority of countries would only see that turning next year or the year after, and for some, maybe even in 2024. What is driving this divergence? One, where countries come from, how much fiscal space they had at the start of the crisis, what are their structural vulnerabilities? Are they dependent on the sectors that are contact heavy and are hammered by the pandemic? Second, they are, of course, in a different place depending on how they're progressing on vaccinations and on protecting against the pandemic. This is now turning into a huge divider. And then third, what we see at this particular point is some being able to lean forward, as US has done with 1.9 trillion package and now a new infrastructure package in hands, and accelerate the recovery for fairness, for their benefits and the benefit of the rest of the world. But then we have countries where mismanagement, misfortunes, and lack of access to vaccines is creating a slow falling behind process. And I would add to that, because you are looking into this issue, some of them are also under the burden of high debt. If you look at the numbers, by 2022, advanced economies will be still 11% below their pre-COVID income per capita level. So they're not, as the whole group is not going to be entirely out of the impact of the crisis, but developing countries, especially low-income countries, much more severely impacted, 20% below their pre-COVID income per capita level, 20% of a small income to begin with. So what then next? What are the risks? And I want to frame three risks, and then I would pass it back to you, John, so we can talk about them. The first risk is that for those that are under a heavy debt level, they may fall into a debt trap. They cannot invest, they cannot grow, they cannot repay, they cannot service their debt, they're stuck. A second risk that applies more broadly is fast-growing economies lifting up interest rates, and especially the US. Obviously, China lifting up interest rates is a different story. If interest rates go up, then access to capital would become more difficult. Capital outflows to the US inevitably will happen. And again, if you have to service that, it becomes much tougher. And the third to my mind is the most severe risk: inability to take advantage of what inevitably is going to be a big transformation moment, accelerating digitalization, accelerating greening of the economy. But you are not in that league, and obviously that can have very long-term implications. There has been a lot of scarring from the crisis, no question about it. Missed educational attainment. We will see structural problems coming once support is being gradually withdrawn. Bankruptcies would go up. We have seen women being pushed out of labor market in bigger numbers than men. Young people not being able to enter because we are all at home. All of these things would have more profound implications. Why should we care? We care because the recovery of the world economy would be slowed down. And we care because that can undermine not only the well-being of people, not only we would lose progress on poverty and hunger, but it would undermine global stability with all the negative consequences falling from that. So that is the shadow that is unfortunately high on our minds.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that broad setting of the stage and enumerating the challenges and the implication of the divergence in the first instance. Let's turn now to perhaps some new news. The G20 finance ministers just recently concluded their meeting, and they just issued their communique. Was there any notable agreements and developments from coming out of the G20?
There sure have been very remarkable developments, and I want to talk about three of them. First, tax. We have been stuck in the OECD trying to peddle tax reforms for quite some time, and now we are unstuck. And I cannot praise more Secretary Yellen, who played a very constructive role, both on minimal corporate tax and on advancing a discussion around digital taxation, international business taxation, but it boils down primarily to digital.
Yes.
We are highly supportive of the minimum corporate tax. You probably remember this, John, from days back.
Oh, yes.
If we want to close a loophole for tax avoidance and rushing with your money to tax havens, best to have a minimal tax and to try to enforce it globally. And of course, we were very worried that country by country resolution on digital tax is going to be highly problematic. So hopefully the G20 says by the middle of the year, by July, we want to make progress. And it sounded like there is a lot of energy around this topic. Secondly, new allocation of special drawing rights that affects the work of the fund directly. We are very pleased that the G20 basically endorsed that, meaning that given there were also non-G20 members at the meeting, I take it to mean that in principle there is a stamp of approval. We still have to do the work. Yeah. We have to prepare a very robust proposal, improve transparency of the SDRs, and in parallel we got a wonderful mandate to work on reallocating on lending SDRs from countries that get it but don't need it to countries that so much need more concessional finance. That, by the way, is going to be a very dynamic conversation. And
Yeah.
three, the G20 approved another, as they said, last extension of the debt service suspension initiative. Again, for countries in trouble, a very valuable step. Beyond this very concrete outcomes, a revival of the sustainable finance group, with elevating it to do more structured work, a lot of attention to climate and how G20 finance ministers and central bank governors can contribute to the transition to the new climate economy. A lot of interventions on inequality and how important it is to address it before it turns into a drag on growth. So all in all, very productive, very good meeting. And the communique, I think, shows that the Italian presidency is starting on a strong footing.
Yeah, that's excellent news. That sounds like perhaps the most substantive G20 communique since the global financial crisis leading up to the London summit in 2009. But I'd imagine in the current environment, shall we say, the finance ministers, it's really heartening to see that the finance ministers, central bank governors, were able to come to agreement on substantive moves. The leaders, when they get together and it's more political, that may be more troublesome. But at the level of economics and finance, it sounds like some real decisions were taken. And good luck. Is the elaboration of a format for improving the ability to allocate, as you call it, the SDRs from perhaps wealthier countries to more needy countries. Is that going to require a lot of work, or is that something that the fund is pretty much ready to go?
Well, it will require work for two reasons. The first one is that many flowers are blooming. There are many ideas what could be done.
Yes.
And we will have to make a nice bouquet that the whole membership can align around. And secondly, we want to be sure that we think of all possible angles of making this work. And while we have run a test drive on that kind of reallocation, if you remember last April, when the crisis hit, and we looked at the world and we realized that low-income countries are in trouble and emerging markets with weak fundamentals are in trouble. I asked the membership to triple our concessional lending capacity. I'm so glad they did. Part of the way they did it was by on-lending SDRs, existing SDRs, to the fund for the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. Mm-hmm. What is clear is that using the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust is a no-brainer. We have done it, we know how to do it, and there is need to do more of it. So I am making a educated guess that this would be one avenue, but there may be others, and I can tell you some of the interventions, wide-ranging, mm-hmm. were use it for greening, concessional finance for structural transformation, needed for countries to meet their Paris obligations, create fiscal space. That, for those of us who know what the fund did in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, reminds us of phasing out dying industries intervention. Some would say, how about creating a facility to pre-fund vaccinations, something like advanced purchase commitment facility. The fund has never done anything like this, but there is a pressing need. That was a formal proposal from Mexico and Argentina, create a facility or a fund to help middle-income countries in with debt difficulties. Some came and said, how about small island states? Or small states overall. So we will have to go through this accordion of views and come up with something that is and we have to move very quickly, because obviously money makes best impact when it is available.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it sounds like the work agenda is going to be very full, but allow me to plug a favorite publication of mine, which is your Global Policy Agenda, which I recommend to the audience. If they don't regularly read it, I think they should. There we are. It's a terrific summary of the fund's not the outlook, but its own intentions with regard to what it sees its role and its forward-looking agenda will be. You've just released it, and there you have it. What are the elements that you'd like to underscore for the audience as to where you see the fund concentrating in addition to the things we've just talked about?
The crisis did us a favor in a way last year, because it forced us to focus. And in April last year, the global policy agenda was very focused, not going all over the whole array of things the fund is doing, but zeroing in on those that are absolutely critical. This year, the theme is a fair shot. A fair shot, obviously, in the arm. Make sure that we get everybody everywhere vaccinated. Advocacy for accelerating vaccination as the best use of public money today. Vitor, our director for fiscal affairs, says the best maybe in history, because if we vaccinate everybody, we accelerate the recovery. The calculations say that this would bring 1 trillion extra fiscal revenues to advanced economies. 1 trillion. So even if you take the more expensive vaccines, $30 a shot, it still makes huge use of that instrument for the recovery of your own economy. We are not talking here about, charity and being kind to other people, which is also important. Secondly, a fair shot at the recovery. And there we concentrate on what steps need to be taken by countries themselves, what are the policies, but also what is the international community going to do specifically to help vulnerable countries. And mind you, I'm saying vulnerable countries, although we primarily focused on the low-income countries, because there are middle-income countries that are highly vulnerable today. Tourism-dependent small islands, just to name one example. We calculated, and it is in our global policy agenda, in our reports, that low-income countries would need, over the next 5 years, $200 billion just to deal with the impact of this crisis. Catch up on education, make sure that they deal with unemployment, that there is some reskilling, that businesses are functioning. And another 250 billion to catch up with their pre-pandemic convergence path to the higher income countries.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, how do we come up, countries themselves raising more revenues, the fund and the other partners. So, and then we got into a fair shot at the future, which is digital, green, more equitable. On digital, what we are advocating is accelerated investment in digital infrastructure and in skills. On green, we have a very strong comparative strength-based program on climate, very aggressively moving into helping our membership in that transition. And on inclusive, what does it mean for fiscal policy to be more supportive of opportunities, access to opportunities for all? That frames our work program, and I can tell you we have engaged with our board on some of these big ticket items. On digital specifically, for us, the most important two issues are digital money, how would they influence the international monetary system, and financial inclusion. We also look at moving to e-governance, how to get governments to be on e-platforms. And then we had a very, very rich discussion on a strategy on climate. And it boils down to those who know the fund, follow the fund. It boils down to what is the fund's contribution that is strictly our mandate. If you look at our mandate, you know it better than many, many people. It is macroeconomic financial stability, growth, and employment. Macroeconomic and financial stability are at risk of climate shocks. So are growth and employment, but investing in the climate transition can generate growth and can generate jobs if this investment is done well.
Mm-hmm.
So when you take this, in our work program, it translates into integrating mitigation, transition, and adaptation in surveillance. Obviously, high intensity, carbon intensity countries will do more on mitigation and transition. Highly vulnerable countries more on adaptation. We already have a work program, and I can tell you I am super impressed how much the demand is coming for good policies.
Yeah.
Secondly, climate-related financial stability risks. How can we bring this into the FSAPs? And again, John, to my delight, already 1 in 5 FSAPs integrates climate-related risks, both physical risks and transition risks. 3, capacity development, help ministries of finance and central banks to deal with this big policy challenge. 4, data. Today is a great day because today we launched our experimental climate data dashboard. Objective, integrate climate into quarterly macroeconomic reporting. So you have growth and inflation and employment or unemployment, and then you have carbon intensity. So we can get people to think about this as a straightforward macro policy issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks very much for that, because I know there are folks who have been pleased to hear that the fund is leaning forward in this area, and some who have wondered, what in the world does the IMF have to do with climate change? And I think you've laid this out very, very well. Thank you very much. But now, if I'm not mistaken, you're coming to us straight from a conversation with Mr. John Kerry.
Yes.
And let's how we put this. Is it your impression that the level of ambition on the side of the US government has changed? And how does that, without getting into specifics of individual countries, are you more optimistic that there can be some real progress on a cooperative basis going forward?
Well, very clearly rejoining the Paris Agreement and making it clear that the US would take on ambitious commitments is very welcomed by the rest of the world and very necessary. It is not only in this area, in many others, even those who may not be fans of the United States, and there are some of these countries, not mine, but they are, that leadership that the United States brings, clarity of purpose, ability to mobilize for action, this is something highly, highly valuable.
Mm-hmm.
What I can say in terms of where the world is headed is first, the pandemic not only did not push climate aside, but to the surprise of many, it pushed it more towards center stage. Partially because we recognize how interdependent we are, because the little virus kind of spurred from nature, reminded us how much we depend on nature for our well-being, because we had more time to sit at home and reflect on what matters in life. And also because we had this alignment of stars in 2021. G7, led by a very pro-climate action country, the United Kingdom. Well, they're an island, they're kind of in trouble. See it every time the rain comes, they feel it. Italy, very pro-climate action country, kind of similar situation. They're this
boot, we call it,
that surrounded by water. And then we have COP26 in Glasgow. That is bringing a new momentum. But the second thing is that we have seen over the last years how dramatic the change of climate is. I was reminded today when I was preparing for the conversation with John Kerry that in 6 months in last year, yes, we had the pandemic. We also had 10 million people displaced by climate disasters, 10 million. So I think we are at a point when the combination of science and more political will, a younger generation that is not going to tolerate being left to unlivable planet.
Yes.
All of this is driving change, and the finance community is responding quite remarkably. We see the shift virtually on a daily basis.
Great, thank you. Two more topics before we run out of time. One that you've mentioned that the G20 acted on, sovereign debt. Do you have any anticipation of any changes or developments or work of the fund in not just the details of how many countries are going to have trouble, but how the fund, working in cooperation with others, intends to deal with this? Are there any innovations in mind, and what can you tell us?
We actually published last year a view on this very thoughtful, actually, report on this topic, and it frames it. A lot has improved, but there are new problems. and we have to come up with new solutions to these problems. Where we think there has been progress is on collective action clauses. There has been demonstrably help coming from them in Ecuador and Argentina in the recent debt restructurings. There has been now very important progress in bringing China, India, Saudi Arabia, others in the common framework together with the Paris Club. So you ask us what we think. We think we have to make this common framework work, and then make sure that the private sector also participates. Because the big challenge to all of us is the diversity of lenders and also, for that matter, of borrowers. It is no more easy to get everybody in the same room and just get to a solution around the table. You can't fit them in one room sometimes.
Exactly.
So how, if the common framework on a case-by-case basis helps us to reprofile, restructure, and in some cases reduce debt, that would be a big step forward. So we have 3 countries that ask for treatment under the common framework: Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia. The fund plays a role because this is being done in a context of a fund program. With Chad, we are moving. With Ethiopia, we are moving. There are complications that come from the situation in Tigray. But there is some clarity what issues are, who is involved, how to address it. With Zambia, we are also moving, but we are not yet to a program place. And, it is sort of the last in this line for now. If we are successful, I expect more countries to ask for treatment. If we are not, then we are kind of back to square one in making progress.
Yes, you're so right. If I give a plug to the work that the Bretton Woods Committee its Sovereign Debt Working Group points out the complications that I think this audience understands, that the diversity of forms of borrowing by the debtor countries is much more complex, but also the universe of creditors is much broader and more complex. And so we face issues of transparency, fair burden sharing, ensuring private sector participation, and exploring, are there some new forms of standardization of borrowing that could help produce greater stability and avoid debt problems. But I know you're going to be working on these, and the fund hopefully is going to have an important leadership role in this area.
And of course, we look very much forward to the work of your group. We will very carefully continue to study what comes out.
We look forward to that. My final question, before we run out of time, well, we're going to have a few minutes to turn to see if the audience has some questions. There's been a lot of talk about the demise of the post-World War II international order of institutions and their loss of relevance. Let me, without leading the witness, let me invite you to ask, now that you've been in the chair at on 19th Street for a while, what's your view about the institutionalization and specifically the role of the fund now and going forward?
But there is no question that the world is more complex. There are more centers of power. There is more complexity in geopolitics that inevitably, that we have more members. I mean, we have 190 members. It was 44 that signed for the Bretton Woods institutions. So At the same time, we also have, if we talk about the mandate of the fund, we are in a different place in terms of the elements of financial stability, with central banks building big reserves, 11 trillion, that is not to be ignored, of course. We have markets playing capital markets, financial markets, much bigger role. We have the ability of countries to finance themselves at low cost, and frankly, sometimes at higher risk than it should have been happening. So we operate in this different environment. But there are three things that I value tremendously that I don't think have changed. One, the surveillance mandate of the fund. Nobody else does it. There is nobody else keeping a hand on the pulse of national economies and the world economy. And if you follow the press this last couple of days, they were all with the flagships of the fund, the World Economic Outlook, the Fiscal Monitor, the Global Financial Stability Report, because it is global public good. To the transmission line of the fund for policymakers. We take it for granted, but it is not for granted that finance authorities and central banks, when the crisis hit, will step up with fiscal support and monetary policy accommodation. It comes from that transmission line, of course, in the G20 and the G7, but we play a very important role. And the view of the fund, if we were to come and say, do not spend, you don't have the money in this crisis, it would have been a big mistake, but it probably would have slowed down this action. No, we came with the right message, and it was spend, keep the receipts, spend. Now we are recalibrating the message because we are moving in a different crisis. We are saying, be specific about the support you need to provide given your place in the crisis. Be mindful of your impact on others. So this second thing is so important: policy harmonization, policy coordination. And three, first responder in a crisis to those who had no other place to go to. We did it. We got 86 countries receiving support from the fund. I read here and there people saying, oh, why didn't the fund lend much more? Which is, sorry to say that, but what? If the markets are working, we are there for those who cannot access them. If the markets are working, if you borrow at 4% or 5% or 6%, which is just about, not very far from us, we are not there. But for the countries that had no access, continue to have no access, we are, together with the World Bank, and we have stepped up. I'll give you one number and then I'll stop. Africa, lending to Africa. Last year, our lending was 13 times bigger than our average lending a year in the previous decade. So here we are, and we constantly strive to upgrade ourselves so we can do what is necessary.
Excellent. Emily, are you there? Maybe we have time for a question or two from our participants.
Hi, yes, thank you, Managing Director and John. This was you guys covered the range of questions here. I mean, pretty much all the questions that have come in from the audience, you have covered. We had a lot of questions on interest rates, on debt, on the fund's mandate and climate. So maybe I'll ask one summary question here. We did have a couple of questions that came in also on climate refugees and migration, and also on corruption. And so maybe I just want to ask, what are these issues being overlooked in light of everything else that's going on? What are your thoughts on that?
I will start with corruption. Yeah, definitely not overlooked.
Yes.
When we did our emergency financing, we really asked for two things. One, help your doctors, your nurses, your vulnerable people, your vulnerable parts of the economy. 1. 2, keep the receipts. And we introduced audits of COVID-related expenditures so we can see whether indeed money is used to boost what is pressing in this crisis. Beyond the crisis, beyond the emergency financing, and actually we are publishing it, I think it's going to come in about a week, a report on all the measures that have been taken in emergency financing to strengthen governance and protect against corruption. Beyond that, we now have almost universally governance elements in our programs and governance as part of our surveillance, because it is very clear that if governance is shady and ineffectual, people suffer. We pay particular attention to quality of first, how you raise your taxes. Do you collect them, or there are people who are hiding in the shadows? How can that be improved? And 2, how do you spend the money? What is the quality of your spending? There are some dramatic findings, like in a big block of countries, 60% of public investments are kind of wasteful. Yeah, obviously, what is the point of putting more money if money goes in a deep black hole? So that is very relevant for the work of the fund. And we are very open to ideas of what more we can do. I personally am a big fan of transparency. I think the fund has a huge role to push transparency in beneficial ownership in contracts, transparency in procurement, in accountability to citizens. And that, I think, is an area where the fund has to build more, but it is totally integrated in the work. Refugees. We are stepping into understanding this topic, and in some countries, like in Jordan, it was integrated in the program. But this whole box that is called fragility, conflict, violence, we want to be more effective. And we will have in the summer a discussion with our board on how we can lift up the role of the fund in fragile environments. And that would bring this issue of refugees more front and center.
Exactly. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. I can't thank you enough, first of all, for your participation. I can't tell you how much I admire your, I think many folks here in the audience may understand what a whirlwind you've been through this week, that you have the energy to appear calm, cool, and collected all day, every day, when we know there's an awful lot at stake. But I want to thank you most of all for your excellent leadership of the IMF. As we all know, to members of the Bretton Woods Committee, a key element of progress in economic and financial well-being. And we certainly wish you all the luck in the world. Let us hope together that one of the outcomes of this terrible year of crisis, of pandemic, will be a renewed commitment to cooperative efforts in forging a better, more durable, and fairer international economic and financial system. So, Emily, Managing Director, I don't know if you have any final words, but
just a word of thanks to the Bretton Woods Committee. Please stand by us, push us to go further and to go faster. Thank you.
That we will do.
Thank you, Managing Director.
Emily? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Managing Director. The Bretton Woods Committee is here to support you. So thank you very much. I'll echo John's comments for your critical leadership during this time. And that'll wrap it up for today. I just want to remind our audience that our final session for the annual meeting will be on Friday morning at 9 a.m. We'll be talking about green investments, and we'll be continuing some of the conversation today. So we hope you all will join us Friday. Thanks again, Managing Director, and thank you, John, for an incredible conversation.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.